Okay, well, let's turn to the WEF and let's turn to the global utopists and to what happened in Canada. The Canadian truckers here, they were pushing back against what they regarded as unwarranted government overreach and intrusion into their private lives on the COVID front fundamentally. And I was a supporter of the truckers right from day one. I believe, like you do, that truckers and farmers and the men, particularly the men and the women who work on those frontline occupations, have a pragmatic wisdom that the intellectual types often don't. And I've also noted too that the intellectual socialist types really like the working class in principle, but they actually don't like the working class as such because they tend not to hold the same utopian intellectual views that the globalists do. And so we saw that in spades in Canada. And I've seen my government take a turn for the worse on multiple dimensions in Canada that's jaw-dropping in its continuity and depth. And it's clearly the case that Canadians haven't woken up to that yet, although perhaps they're starting to. And a huge part of that is this appalling and unconscionable media collusion. And so now we see something similar happening in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands. And we should let everyone know, and you have to listen to this. This is so important. You know, the Netherlands is the world's second biggest exporter of agricultural products. This little tiny postage stamp of a country that was scraped out of the ocean has managed to put itself together so that it can not only feed itself, but so that it's a major agricultural supplier worldwide. It's a phenomenal accomplishment. We should be so happy with the Dutch farmers that we can hardly stand ourselves. And instead, the courts in particular have mandated that the farmers be scuttled. And the government, their own government, has basically come out right out and said, well, because you guys pollute so much, we have to crack down on you, as well as reducing the speed limits of our cars, which is another appalling move. And we're sorry, but a lot of you are going to have to go out of business. But, you know, that's, to make an omelet, a few eggs have to be broken. And as the president of Greenpeace in the Netherlands said recently, well, we know we're not going to combat climate change, the climate change emergency, without inconveniencing a few people. And now there's, 40,000 truckers in the Netherlands who are up in arms. And I believe 100,000 people have protested in Spain. And this is spreading into Germany and into the fishermen in the Netherlands as well, who are also being pressured by these utopian types. And so how do you tie that into what happened in Canada and the US? And what do you think's going on?
Well, it's all part of this larger World Economic Forum attacks on us, of course. And by the way, I lived in Europe for 6 years. Ich spreche Deutsch. Ich habe in Deutschland 4 Jahre gewohnt. I lived 4 years in Germany. I lived 2 years in Poland. And I've been all over Europe, right? But mostly not recently. Mostly I've been in Asia recently and other places. And so, but yeah, it's clear that, for instance, when I was recently in Mexico, following the migrants just streaming across, in May alone, we had about 310,000 illegally crossed into the United States in 1 month. And so
How
when
many?
I saw that
310,000.
Roughly 310,000 known crossed just in May, right? And so, and I'm not sure what that number is this last month. I've tried, I don't know the number yet, but the bottom line is it's increasing at a very high rate. And this human osmotic pressure, I call it HOP, human osmotic pressure, the push and pull of migration, is greatly fueled by, one, information campaigns, which I've seen in Colombia, for instance, on CNN, encouraging people to go north. And also, obviously, another thing that causes HOP is war, famine, pandemic, and also the economic negative pressure, which would draw you into another place, right? So there's the positive pressure that pushes you out and the negative pressure that pushes you in, pulls you in. And this is really dramatically expanding. You can see this also in Europe. As you know, they're being overwhelmed with hungry mouths, actually, as we go into a global famine, which I've been warning about daily for 30
let's
months.
Let's talk about this global famine, man, because I see that coming in the fall in a big way. And so my sense is, well, partly because of the Ukraine conflict and the fact that we're wiping out a big chunk of the world's wheat supply and fertilizer supply, that we're going to be putting about 150 million people under intense food pressure, really starting this fall. I think that's when it's going to kick in. And my sense is, well, there's no way that can happen without mass migration pressure on Europe, maybe of a scale that makes the last migration crisis look like virtually nothing. And so am I being paranoid about that? You seem to be thinking along the same lines. And you said you've seen this coming for about 3 years.
I think you're understating it, actually.
So what's going to happen in the fall?
I started warning in January of 2020, actually, and I've warned every day since. And I've at this point I warn about a half a dozen times a day. So, war. Let's talk about war first. Pandemic, famine, war. The triangle of death. They always go together. If you get a big war or a big pandemic or a big famine, you'll get the other two. You get one, you get the other two. It's three musketeers, and all of these things. Any one of them creates the HOP, human osmotic pressure, right? So these things go together. So when I saw this, I was one of the very first alerting on the pandemic, right? I was in January, in mid to somewhere around January 19th, I think I started warning about pandemic, and so immediately, having studied war for so many years, not just kinetic war and the shootouts and all that. I did that for years, back when I was quite skinny and running around out in the wars and all that. But there's also information war, which is the PhD level of warfare. And then there's these other components that people must study if they're going to be a serious student of war, which is migration, pandemic, and famine. They always go together. Period. Right.
Okay. So let me ask you a question about that. So my sense was that on the pandemic front, that because we disrupted the supply chains, and we have by no means fixed that in the least. There's a shortage. You can't get a car in Canada. You can't get a motorbike. You can't get a personal watercraft. You can't get paper and cardboard for books. There's a massive backlog and lineup for everything. I know that one container ship in 5 is now snared at a port. And so I know what happens when you put pressure on the supply chain. The people who suffer for that the most are the people at the bottom of the economic hierarchy. And so those are going to be people that are barely hanging on in developing countries, especially in North Africa. That'll be my guess where this is going to have the biggest effects. And so, if you show a 1% increase in unemployment, you get a 5% increase in psychiatric hospitalization. And that's because there's a lot of people who are just barely making ends meet. And then if you double the cost of necessities like energy or, let's say, fertilizer, or we could even put in food, then you're going to produce a tremendous amount of economic pressure on these people, tilt them into starvation. And so we've seen what's happened in Sri Lanka, which is just an absolute bloody major significant ongoing catastrophe. 21 million people in Sri Lanka. There's no way we're going to be able to feed them in any real sense for any long period of time. So all that eco movement forward on the Sri Lankan front is going to ensure that those poor starving people are going to eat every goddamn animal in that entire country to stave off starvation. And then they're going to burn everything for fuel, because what the hell else are they going to do? So this idea that we can make people poor, hungry, cold or hot by scaling back food production and disrupting energy supplies, and that's somehow going to save the planet, is as backwards a conception as any dimwit could possibly formulate. And so, so what do you think is going to happen in the fall?
Massive famines. And, I went to Sri Lanka 4, 5, 6 years ago to have a look-see. I'm often just going and looking and checking the police and the food supply. And there was plenty of food. Sri Lanka had so much food. It was just like cheap and plentiful, right? And then the next thing you know, here we go. Now, famine.
It was doing well.
Yeah, one thing about famine. Famine creates famine in the same way that war creates war and fire creates fire. Famine creates famine. So when we go into these initial phases of famine, you'll see immediately, obviously, price controls will start to be enforced. This happens every time. It's happening right now in Panama in the last 48 hours, right? Price controls on gasoline and some other things.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of violence now in Panama. In fact, just minutes before you and I came on, I was talking with a friend in Panama about the current situation. That's how close I keep tabs on Panama, and for various reasons. One is the Panama Canal, and so another thing is for instance, when people are hungry. As you know, within 48 hours, they're going to hit the streets, right? And they'll start robbing the stores. They'll start robbing the trucks and the trains and the boats. And so then supplies stop going. Governments always start taking food from the farmers. without exception, in my study over the years, the governments always go for the farmers, and like in Egypt recently, forcing the Egyptian farmers to sell to only approved warehouses, that sort of thing. So people start robbing from the farmers as well, right? And then the farmers say, hey, I'm either bankrupt or I'm not making any money. And so the farmers stop farming. So that's how you see we get into the second season of this, right? And so the famine creates more famine, just like fire creates fire. And then famine, let's say you have 20 million people that are hungry in Sri Lanka, and as their nutritional resources diminish, so too does their physical resilience, and now they're open to disease. Many of the people that die in famines actually die from things like, they call them famine fevers. One of those is typhus, another is relapsing fevers. Cholera, which is not a famine fever, waterborne, of course, fecal. Anyway, the bottom line is many of the people, if not most, who die during famines are actually from disease. And then this causes that human osmotic pressure, and these sorts of things often lead to more war, right? So it's a recursive sort of, the factors just keep, it's almost a fission reaction, right? And it reaches a critical mass and it's out of control.
Positive feedback loop. Yeah.
Right.
Runaway, Pareto distribution problem, runaway catastrophe. Yeah, I get it. Positive feedback loops emerging everywhere. And why do you think, what are the factors that are driving the reemergence of the famine? You said there's a lot of instability in Central America, and so we're going to keep an eye out there. Obviously, Sri Lanka has collapsed entirely, and there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that a major part of the reason that Sri Lanka collapsed is because the globalist utopians gathered the reins of government in Sri Lanka, because it was actually developing at quite a rate. And as you said, it had a lot of food and not a bad general income level just a few years ago. So this wasn't a catastrophic country to begin with. It was a country on the move upward, and it was completely scuttled by these globalist plans. And so what's contributing to the developing famine right now and where do you think it's going to be most intense?
Where will it be the most intense? That's something I think about every single day. One of the things I've learned in wars and in the study of war is whatever you think will probably turn out to be wrong.
Yeah.
You know this. I watch so many of your programs. The systems that emerge will present themselves in due course, right? What we can see is when I talk with Laura Logan, the famous correspondent, she'll say, they've been talking about, 1.2 billion, they meaning World Economic Forum, have been talking about 1.2 billion people forced to migrate. They've been talking about that for years, and it's true.
Yeah, and they're going to blame it. They're bloody well going to blame it on climate change. You watch. That's
absolutely.
What they're going to do.
Absolutely.
You bet. Yeah.
Everything's
so 1.2 billion.
Change.
1.2 billion. So my estimation of 150 million is, you think, is optimistic.
I think highly optimistic. I would not be surprised, Jordan, I would not be surprised if by 2025, if 1 billion people aren't dead. I mean, we're really heading into the most epic famines that have ever happened in human history. I watched this 7 days a week.
Man, I was looking at a Economist cover the other day, the Economist magazine, and it said 20 million people saved by COVID vaccine. And I thought, yeah, you bastards, for every million persons that you saved with the lockdowns and the whole vaccination, not the vaccination scam, but the pandemic panic, you're probably going to kill 50 because of supply chain disruptions and postponed starvation. And so, that's part of the problem with turning political decisions over to the medical experts is that, well, we save some people with the left hand and we doom 100 more with the right hand. And there is a lag. We basically tried to shut down the world's economy for 2 years as if we could do that because, well, look, everything's so plentiful, isn't it? Doesn't it matter at all that people aren't going to go to work? It turns out that it actually matters a lot. And so